Yeah, well, it's like, when I was in there, we had, so I worked on fighters, but the fighters had cameras in them. They didn't have any guns. But they would tell nobody that. So one of the cameras we had was a forward-looking infrared. One is a jet and your camera in the nose looking forward. Infrared at that. You know, it would be looking down at the ground. That one camera was for chasing UFOs.
So I told you to try to read the Transcendentalist, Emerson, Thoreau. That's who we'll talk about today. I don't think we're going to get to Douglas, but there will be at least one or two questions about Douglas's passage. Let's start with Emerson, or maybe let's start with a definition of transcendentalism. So transcendentalism is like a movement within the Romantic period. It's not like a period of its own. It's kind of like a sub-movement, I guess. Maybe we should take the word apart and figure out what it means. What's the root of transcendentalism?
Transcend.
To transcend. Alright, so let's take transcend apart. Trans means what?
Go through.
Yeah, it has to do with movement, right? Like if you transport something or transfer something, you move it from one place to another. So to transcend literally means to move beyond. How about that? To move beyond. We'll go with that. So it has to do with moving beyond, and it's a movement beyond the earthly realm to a more spiritual realm. So I guess if we had to define what transcendentalism means, it's kind of like this belief or this practice of attempting to transcend, move beyond the physical world into something more spiritual, or to transcend our animalistic nature into something greater. Does that make sense? So at the heart, we are animals, right?
Yeah.
Homo sapiens are just another species of animal.
Just a beast.
Right. So it has a lot to do with what separates us, I guess, from other animals. Sometimes people call that like our humanity, like what makes us human, what makes us stand out from the other animals. And what is that? Bianca, what do you think? What sets us apart from animals? Knowledge. My dog's smart though. My dog knows the whole neighborhood. She knows where to go to find food. What's that?
Does the dog go to school?
I don't know. I don't know what he does when I'm not home, but I doubt it. Okay, so maybe knowledge, maybe the application of knowledge, maybe how we use it or go about seeking it. That could be part of it.
There are limits to it, as in we're able to learn more things than the dog would learn.
There's some smart dogs out there, and there's some dumb people out there too.
I mean,
You ever see when they teach like chimpanzees how to do sign language?
yes.
Have we ever seen that before?
Yeah.
Or how they teach dolphins to do all those tricks?
Yeah, but they don't have the ability to ask, who am I? You know.
How do you know? Maybe they do, we just don't hear it.
Maybe they just feel it. Maybe they do have a language of their own, because babies can communicate with dogs.
And they say dolphins can communicate with each other.
Yeah.
I mean, we don't really know what they're saying though, do we?
I know.
They say dolphins are like maybe the
Closest thing.
as far as intelligence goes, maybe the second smartest creatures in the world. Now, of course, it's a person saying that, right? So that means that we automatically elevate ourselves above the dolphins.
Maybe they're smart enough.
So let's just say maybe dolphins are highly intelligent, and maybe some dolphins are smarter than some of the dumbest people. What sets us apart from animals then? Say it again.
Walk upright.
We walk upright, that's true. So just how we get along in the physical world is part of it. I guess what we've done to maybe conquer the physical world, we've conquered pretty much every other species, right?
We're at a pause.
What's that?
We're at a pause. We haven't gone during his invitations.
Okay, so evolutionarily, maybe we're at a plateau of some sort.
Been steady for 200,000 years.
Okay, as far as science can tell us, right? Are other creatures still evolving and we're not?
That's a good question.
Are we as highly evolved as we're going to get?
No.
I don't think so.
You don't think so?
My daughter knows way more than I knew at her age.
Uh-huh.
She can sit down and read a book when she's 6 years old.
Right.
I couldn't write or read anything until probably first.
So future generations are showing signs of maybe being more highly evolved or more intelligent. Okay.
Well, you can actually see the change in the structure of the brain through the first 7 years. If you teach a child a musical instrument,
Right.
like a violin or piano, they gain these notches in the folding of the brain.
Right.
Yeah.
Okay, counter argument though. Some of the best musicians ever were from like the 1700s, right? Like Beethoven and Mozart. Like few composers today rival those composers of the Baroque era. At least according to most musicians. Right? Some people might say, no way, Metallica's way better than Beethoven, right?
Yeah.
But still, I mean, there were some pretty darn good musicians, darn good painters. Leonardo da Vinci,
Yep.
he was a genius, right? Like he
Yeah.
was inventing helicopters in the, what, 1400s maybe?
James, helicopters, parachutes.
Right. So that's a counter argument. Yes, we do see some really smart people today, but we saw some smart people a long time ago. And when we think about literature too, some of the literature that might be in this textbook, I have students say, I can't get through it. I can't process it. It's too difficult. It's not really difficult. It's just sometimes high-minded, right? Sometimes the vocabulary is a little bit difficult to get through. There's somewhat of a dumbing down of our language, I think, over the past few hundred years. But maybe language is something that separates us, the ability to communicate, like what you were saying. Could have something to do with language. What else could separate human beings from animals? What allows us to transcend the physical world?
Self-awareness.
Self-awareness. So does a dog know he's a dog?
I don't know. That's a good question.
My ferret thought it was a cat.
What's that?
My ferret thought it was a cat for like forever since I got it. Yeah. So
Okay.
But it would act like a cat.
You ever see those videos where it's like a, you know, like a little kitten being raised by a dog or something like that?
Some dogs think they're people.
Dogs
Then
think they're
again,
people. Yeah, like when it gets up on the couch, it's like,
Right.
dude, you're not allowed on the couch.
then
And
again,
there's
there's
people
all
that,
those.
go ahead,
I think you're gonna say something else.
that think they're dogs.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right. We'll throw them out. We'll say that they're the outliers. We're not going to count them as part of our species. They're just weirdos. Okay, so self-awareness could be a big thing. And actually that ties in very closely to the Romantic period. I gave you 3 fundamental ideas for the Romantic period. Remember what they were? If you had to define this period in 3 words, I gave them to you. 3 concepts.
Nature, art, and self.
Nature, art, and the self. So the self-awareness, understanding that you are you and you have a place in the universe. That has a lot to do with transcendentalism and the whole Romantic period. So that idea of self-awareness, I think, is very critical toward maybe what differentiates us from other species and what maybe the transcendentalists would say allows us to transcend the physical world. What else, Benjamin?
Animals don't have souls.
They don't have souls. And that might come down to the self-awareness thing. Like, people only have souls if they believe they have souls, right?
They're incapable of love.
Animals? Alright, let's expand the definition and just say emotion. Like, do dogs really have emotion? Is your dog really guilty when you get home and it peed on the floor and it's got its tail between its legs? Is your dog literally feeling guilt? Or is it just remembering the last time it did this and it's just like a instinctual fear?
Remember the last time you did this. It's just like, I wonder what this person's gonna do to me.
So when you get home and your dog didn't pee on the floor and it's wagging its tail and it's got its tongue out, and it looks like it's smiling, is your dog really happy? Is that an emotion that a dog feels?
The elephants mourn their loss of their young.
Yeah. A lot of animals do.
So is that emotion then?
Classification.
I would think that's about as close as you can get.
I mean, how could you say no since we have no communication?
They've done studies to try to figure it out. They've concocted studies. I don't know that the results are going to be conclusive. But like one thing they did, like with the dog thing, they would have a control group where they would have a group of people with their dogs, and they would tell them, okay, your dog did something wrong. Your dog peed on the floor or something like that. and the dog didn't really do that. Then they have another group where the dog actually did do something wrong, like chewed on a shoe that it wasn't supposed to, right? And they would have the two groups go home and greet their dogs, and both groups of dogs would display the same type of guilt, right? Even though this group of dogs did nothing wrong, so what they decided, it was probably the way that the owners were approaching the dogs, and the dogs could kind of read the body language. So they were only going based off what the owner was acting like. Does that make sense? So your dog, if it does pee on the floor, it probably doesn't have its tail between its legs before you get home. It's only when you get home, right? Like it's not necessarily guilty. So they've done studies like that, but like I said, can't prove a whole lot from that.
Yeah, I disagree with that. I also disagree with that soul comment. I don't know where in the world, but again, that's, human beings thinking they're more than everybody else or anything else.
And you can't do that without self-awareness, right?
Mm-hmm.
So the self-awareness is definitely part of it. But the self-awareness could lead to the belief of the soul, right? So we believe, because you can't transcend the physical world into a spiritual world if you don't believe in the spiritual world to begin with.
Right.
So do dogs believe in a spiritual world? Do dogs know that they're going to die? Do they know that something is or is not going to happen when they die? Do
But
they
then
know that...
How do you prove that humans have souls? Because we're afraid if we die, what's going to happen?
Mhm.
So, you could say that humans concoct something to make them feel okay
Definitely.
with where their life is
Definitely.
ultimately ending up.
Yeah, and that's what a lot of atheists will believe, or agnostics will believe. Absolutely. Yeah,
So if animals aren't afraid of that, then
maybe they have
How
more
would
of a
they-
belief
you
in
know?
maybe they have more of a belief in their souls because they're not scared.
Yeah,
Like,
they're
I'm gonna be fine.
confident.
All dogs go to heaven, right?
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking.
So anyway, this idea of transcendentalism, though, this is what some of these writers during the time period really latched onto, and trying to figure out, okay, if there is anything beyond this physical world, what is it? How do we access it? How do we tie into it? What is our place in the world, in the physical world and beyond? That's kind of what they were after. And I would say they did have some kind of belief in something other than the spirit, than the physical world, because that's where the whole idea of transcending comes in. That there is something beyond just the physical world that you can tap into or channel or, I don't know, find yourself as part of at some point, whether it be during life or after death. It's kind of what they get to. So I guess that sums up transcendentalism. I can't really give you a perfect, brief, concise definition. I'll tell you this. It was uniquely American. It was a uniquely American idea. And when I say uniquely American, think of things like jazz or rock and roll, right? Uniquely American traditions. Baseball, maybe? It's uniquely American, right? American football. But this was like the first thing. And the Romantic period was 1820 to 1860, called the Golden Age of American Literature. Also called the Literary Renaissance, which is actually not a very good name, because Renaissance literally means what? Renaissance. It's got R-E at the beginning, which means what?
Isn't rebirth.
Rebirth. Okay, like there was a rebirth in Europe and worldwide after the Dark Ages, right? After the bubonic plague and after the church was kind of stamped out for a while. There was a rebirth of the arts, and that's when you had people like Da Vinci and Michelangelo and all these artists. That was literally a rebirth of the arts. In America, they say that the 1820 to 1860 was an American literary renaissance, but that doesn't make sense because America never had this flourish of literature to begin with. So it wasn't a rebirth, it was more like an original birth. Does that make sense? They call it the Renaissance, but there was really no American literary culture to start with. I mean, we're reading stuff from the pre-colonial, the colonial era, the revolutionary period, but this wasn't recognized worldwide as like wonderful literature. It wasn't. We maybe look at it now and say, okay, there's some really good stuff there, but I mean, look what we read. There were a few creation stories, there were some letters and accounts from explorers. There wasn't a whole bunch of novels and poetry coming out of America for a long time. If it was, it wasn't necessarily what we would consider to be American. Because in order to have a cultural identity, you have to establish the culture first. right? And like Krebscourt said, at first it was just a whole bunch of people coming from different places. So it was more like that salad than the stew or the melting pot. Even though it was becoming the melting pot, it took a while for that to happen. In order to have something, in order to have truly American literature, you need a period of time where people become American. Does that make sense? So the first people that came over here didn't necessarily consider themselves American. They considered themselves French.
Yeah, or Irish.
Or, yeah, whatever it was. And they usually, congregated with people of the same type. The idea of immigration is pretty important to this country, and it's important during this election cycle too. Somebody said, who was it? Yeah, somebody said let's build a wall. Marco Rubio said, to great applause, we need to distinguish between people who want to live in America and people who want to be American. Kind of distinguishing like two types of immigrants. Those that maybe want to just come here, make a lot of money, send it back to their families in other countries, and those who want to come and absorb the culture and become members of the society. Does that make sense? Like there's a difference. Like you could go, if I said, hey Stephen, I've got a job for you in China, it pays $1 million a year. Do you want to go there? Stephen might say, heck yeah. That doesn't mean he wants to be Chinese though. It just means he wants to go to China to make the money. Some people might want to go to China and really adopt that culture. It's a great place for them to be, and that's what they want to do. So this idea of immigration is important too when we talk about an American literary renaissance. Because this is the period of time where, okay, colonists banded together and won the war. That was a big deal. When did the Revolutionary War end? When did it start? Give me a date.
We should know that, huh?
When did the Revolutionary War start? About. This is not a hard one. This should not be a hard one.
1776.
1776, right? When you signed the Declaration of Independence, say, King, we're out, we are our own country, that was pretty much the first shot fired, right? So you could say the Revolutionary War started then. When did it end? And here's a question for you. Why don't people know that?
Because it
Was America a free country on July 4th, 1776?
Yeah.
Was America a free country on July 5th, 1776? July 6th, 7th, 8th? They had to fight a war to win their independence. Why don't we celebrate the end of the war when it was actually won?
And then there was another war later. Early 1890s.
The War of 1812?
Yeah.
Yeah, that was kind of like an aftershock. But by that point, there had already been a treaty signed, and Britain had already conceded, okay, you guys win.
Yeah.
Then they kind of said, all right, we want to get back in there and make sure you don't take too much territory, and we want to try and get some back.
Yeah, it was like you started all over almost.
Isn't it important, though, to know when America actually won its independence?
Yeah.
Like, if not, then wouldn't every football team that makes it to the Super Bowl just celebrate, hey, remember that year we went to the Super Bowl? It's not usually the case, though. We celebrate the victors, right? The winners. I don't know. I think that's interesting. I don't even know the date, to be honest with you. I should. I think it was 1784. It was 1783 or 1784. So it was like a 7-year, 8-year war. Which for wars, that's a long time. I mean, contemporarily now, our wars last for 10, 12, 15 years, it seems like. But most wars don't last all that long. The Civil War only lasted 4 or 5 years. So it was like a 7 or 8 year war. That was a big deal. So anyway, after the war, we've got this long period of time, aside from the War of 1812. We've got a time where Americans kind of settle into being Americans. And through that, I think the outline of American literature says, through that shared experience of becoming Americans, do you eventually get American literature and they call it rebirth, which isn't fair, but a birth of culture and literature and art and things like that from the country. So that's the Romantic period. Transcendentalism comes out of that, comes out of the Northeast, Massachusetts, New England area. I feel like I'm missing something about transcendentalism. We talked about the idea of the sublime, right? That overwhelming feeling you get, usually from natural elements. That was part of transcendentalism. I guess that's pretty good background. Let's look at Emerson. He starts on page 505. We will call Ralph Waldo Emerson the father of transcendentalism. He's the culprit. That's right. Oh, one other thing. Now I remember what I wanted to say. Transcendentalism, although it was a uniquely American idea, it was influenced by all types of ideas worldwide. But it was like a conglomeration. Just like jazz. Like, okay, jazz is uniquely American, but it draws from an African American tradition that goes back to Africa with, bass and drum beats that were actually infused into new musical forms in America, right? So even though something's uniquely American, it still draws from other cultural ideas sometimes. Transcendentalism is one of those things. They drew from Eastern religions and philosophies like Confucianism and Buddhism, other Eastern religions. I can't think of any others off the top of my head. But Eastern religions, China, India, other places like that, they had a lot to do with transcendentalism. Alright, so Emerson being the father of transcendentalism, was there anything in his bio that sticks out as interesting, noteworthy? I like what it says about his academic interests on page 505. This is in the second paragraph. Toward the bottom of the second paragraph. Emerson showed no particular promise. Graduating from Harvard 30th in a class of 59, Emerson served, as he put it, a hopeless schoolmaster in several Boston area schools. So being a teacher back then, I guess, was not the goal for Emerson. He was not too happy with that as a occupation. Turning to the study of theology in 1825 at Harvard's Divinity School, he began preaching as a Unitarian in October 1826, and early in 1829 he was ordained by the Unitarians as a junior pastor. So I think he was following a tradition of his family too. I think his dad was maybe a pastor as well. But he kind of changed his mind, kind of bailed out on this Unitarian church. Anybody see why? Yeah, he experienced some personal crisis. 1831, his wife, who he married in 1829, died of tuberculosis at the age of 19. So she was young. How old was he in 1831? 28. So he was pretty young, 28-year-old, lost his 19-year-old wife. I guess it was much more common for women to get married to older guys back then. But it says he was grief-stricken, and it seems like this is what kind of precipitated his spiritual crisis as well. At the very bottom of 505, it says, Emerson notified his church that he had become so skeptical of the validity of the Lord's Supper that he could no longer administer the sacrament, regarding it, as he remarked in his journal, as a worship in the dead forms of our forefathers. So he has a little bit of a spiritual crisis, and not necessarily abandoning God, but starting to see religion in a different way, in a more negative way. It will, but it doesn't seem like he's abandoning God. It doesn't seem like he bails out on God. He just starts to take a much different view of religion as he's seen it. And like when he says it was worship in the dead forms of our forefathers, like he wanted, okay, instead of turning away from God, I think he does the exact opposite. He wasn't fulfilled in the way that he and others during this time period were seeking a relationship with God. Okay, so you're right. Death and crisis usually make people go one of two ways, right? They either run away from God or they run toward God. And I think what he does is run toward God, but he just decides, I can't do it this way. I can't do it through the church. I can't do it through these sacraments, through this, taking of the communion. Like, it didn't mean anything to him.
Yeah, it probably didn't make a whole lot of sense after when you lose someone. It makes you look at things totally different. So I think that may have played something.
Yeah, I think it rearranged his worldview for sure. Let's see if it says anything else interesting here. He was a poet and a non-fiction writer. We'll see a lot of poetry kind of intertwined with transcendentalism. Okay, this is interesting on page 507. This is noteworthy for your quiz too. Third paragraph. Alright, transcendentalism is very concerned with the self and originality. Where do you fit in the universe? Where is your place? Which means it is opposed to group thinking. And I think I've mentioned, maybe along with those inventory statements that I gave you last class, during the Revolutionary period it was important to keep in mind the benefit of the group as a whole, right? Because if you want to win a war, you've got to be all in together. So sometimes you had to subjugate the rights of the individual to the interests of the group, right? During the Revolutionary period, that's kind of the way things had to go for America to win the war. All right, well, once the war is over, now people are thinking, well, we don't have to band together as closely. Let's figure out our own selves, right? Which means don't go along with the crowd on everything, right? Remember Thomas Paine, his whole sales pitch was like, hey, come along with the crowd, get on board with the war. Right, now it's a little bit different. These guys are more reflective, self-reflective. It says here in the third paragraph, precisely because he so valued individual self-culture, Emerson was skeptical of social reforms that required group participation. So these guys are individualists. Okay, like, be original is their deal. It's interesting that we have a group of people that are all about being individualists, right? But they were kind of loosely connected. You know, they did meet, they did have some publications, but they were buried in their writings. It says early in the 1840s he refused to participate in the reformist socialistic community Brook Farm in the West Roxbury, Massachusetts, which drew a number of the transcendentalists associated with the Dial. That was their publication. All right, the Dial was like this journal or magazine that they put out. Abolitionism did engage his attention, however, and in 1844 he delivered a passionate anti-slavery address, Emancipation of the Negroes in the British West Indies, at the Concord Courthouse on August 1st, 1844. So here's the deal. Even though people like Emerson and Thoreau were really against group thinking and these movements where like a group would have to come together and do the same thing, the one thing they did seem to agree on was the abolition of slavery. That was the one group thing they could get behind. Like, all right, we'll get with this group, because there were people called abolitionists, and that was their deal. Like, this is what we're fighting for. So that was the one time they kind of exempt themselves from being original and decide to get with the group. Why do you think that's the case? Why would that be the cause they get behind?
They're all about self.
And slavery is kind of the opposite of that, right? Yeah, those two ideas are pretty much in conflict. So that, you know, someone can't really be self-reflective and transcend as they need to if they're being ruled over by another human being, right? So I think that's because it was in direct conflict with what they believed, they decided to get on board with the abolitionist movement. I think it says at the bottom of this paragraph, he also argued in favor of women's rights too. So abolition of slavery and women's rights he was on board with. There was a transcendentalist figure named Margaret Fuller. I would say there are three primary transcendentalists: Emerson, Thoreau, and Margaret Fuller. So they incorporated, you know, some feminist theories here early on. This is way before women's suffrage. This is way before women really started speaking out politically as a group. So Margaret Fuller was one of the first to kind of advocate for equality between men and women. She does a really good job of it. I didn't assign her just because the Emerson passage and the Thoreau passage are pretty long, along with Douglas. But if you want to read Fuller too, she's pretty good. She's got
a smoker.
What's that?
Is she a smoker?
I don't know. That's a good question. I want to know if these guys were smokers and not just smokers of tobacco, but of other things. Because some of the stuff you read, you're going to be like, wait a minute, what are these guys on?
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, I'm sure someone has done the research to figure it out.
Just curious.
I'd say it's highly likely.
Highly likely?
Yeah.
I would too.
Because wasn't hemp a big, like Washington, Jefferson, they both had hemp farms.
They did, but I don't know that, because there are different types of marijuana, and I know hemp is, you know, you can buy hemp oil at a health food store today, like in America, in Georgia, not just Colorado, because it doesn't have the active ingredient that, or it doesn't have as much of the active ingredient that causes the euphoria. So I don't know, maybe they did, and maybe it was more like tobacco where they did it just like for the flavor, and maybe it wasn't for a high. I don't know, to be honest with you. But yeah, hemp was definitely prevalent as a commodity and a textile producing plant.
Rope and clothing.
Yeah, rope, clothing, all types of stuff they made out of it. So I don't know. And it'd be interesting to know, like, what were they smoking? If they were smoking hemp, what was it? Was it similar to what we think of today, or was it kind of different? I don't know. All right, that's pretty good for background. Let's actually get into the writing. So his first one is called Nature, which fits into the Romantic period, because we say the three defining concepts of the Romantic period are nature, art, and the self. So this is an excerpt. This isn't the whole thing. This is probably his most famous work, although he has many famous works. Emerson is probably considered one of the greatest American writers of all time. He starts out in the introduction by saying our age is retrospective. What does he mean by retrospective? Spective, spectate, means to look.
To look back.
To look back. Our age looks back is what he's saying. Like our age, our people at this time, we are retrospective, we look back. It builds on the sepulchres of the fathers. Sepulchres are the tombs. So our age is building on the tombs of our fathers. It writes biographies, histories, and criticism. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face. We through their eyes. What does that mean?
I was looking back on them.
Probably see.
Does this seem like a good thing? Do you think he's saying this is a good thing? That the foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face. We through their eyes.
Somebody's questioning it.
Questioning it. Which would be better, to behold God face to face or through the eyes and experiences of someone else? Which would you all prefer if it were you?
Face to face.
I want to know.
Face to face? I think that's what he's getting at.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Sometimes I think formal religion is going to separate people from that experience. I think that's what Emerson is trying to get across too, because he was a minister. I mean, the guy was the head of one of these churches that had to practice formal doctrine, had to teach certain things certain ways, had to do sacraments certain ways, because that's the way they're always done, and that's the way the head of the church is going to tell them to do it, right? So I think he says that people have gotten away from this maybe more personal relationship with God, and they're seeing it through the eyes of their fathers and forefathers. He says, why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should not we have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us, and not the history of theirs? Embosom for a season in nature whose floods of life stream around and through us, and invite us by the powers they supply to action proportioned to nature. Why should we grope among the dry bones of the past, or put the living generation into masquerade out of its faded wardrobe? The sun shines today also. There is more wool and flax in the fields. There are new lands, new men, new thoughts. Let us demand our own works and laws and worship. That's a pretty easy to process paragraph there, I think. Like, some of the stuff he says is going to get deeply philosophical, to the point where I cannot process it myself, and I've read it many times. And I can get nuggets, but I can't always process what he writes. But this one seems pretty straightforward, right? Don't look back. Don't live like our fathers did. Let's move forward. So my question to you would be, is this a reaction against the prior time period or a continuation of the prior time period? Because what we're going to see from time period to time period are shifts in thinking. Just like you could see it within one family. You could see one family today, how the kids are not like the parents who are not like the grandparents, because they tend to react against or continue sometimes.
Like a constant reevaluation.
Constant reevaluation. So, but is this moving? All right, so maybe it's like a pendulum swinging back and forth. Is this the pendulum swinging back away from the Revolutionary period, or is it continuing to swing away from the Puritan period?
This is away from the Puritans.
I kind of see it like that too, because
They
the
left
Puritans are
Europe
the.
to come to America to reestablish a good majority their religious threshold.
Right.
their bases. But in the end, it seems like every time that was attempted, people who did that, their names are losing. You know, Facebook was written out. You know, the guy who tried to really push back.
Williams, maybe.
Yeah. Whoever his name is.
Yeah.
And he's a good example, and that started getting pushed back. Then you have the other author who was saying, you know, all these different religions on the same street, it doesn't matter anymore.
So you feel like it's still moving in that direction away from
There was people
the
who
Puritan
definitely
way.
we'd read about that opposed it and tried to change that, but it seems like the majority of the pendulum swing has been a constant swing away.
Yeah.
It continues to this day.
I tend to see it that way too. Have there been, okay, so then you say to this day. So I like to try and bring things into like more contemporary context. Have there been periods in American history, maybe in your lives even, where you've seen the pendulum swing to be more traditional, is the word I'll use. Because I think what he's talking about is tradition, right? The traditions of our fathers, of our forefathers. Have there been periods in American history since the 1800s where things got more traditional or less traditional? Or Jason says he seems to see it continuously swinging away from the traditionalism of the Puritans. Does anybody see it differently, where maybe it's gone back a little bit? You could think decades, 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, 90s.
There have been movements, you know, with, I'm trying to remember, I think it was like in 1901, 1910, there was a big movement of evangelism and stuff like that. Really got to the foothold, especially
Right.
through the southeast and stuff. But as far as the impact of that, I'm not sure.
Let me ask you this: the 1960s, the late 60s, Woodstock,
Yeah.
counterculture, was that less traditional than the 80s? Was the 80s more traditional and conservative?
Probably so.
Generally speaking. I mean, that was pretty away from the Puritan period, right? The
Yeah.
60s, like that's about as far as you can get. Free love.
Yep. That was real transcendent.
So then from the 60s then, have we continued to move in that direction? Or did it ever swing back at all?
Maybe it's doing, we move away from it, but then we always come back to it.
Uh-huh.
I mean,
To some degree.
Yeah.
Maybe not completely, but to some degree.
You would think in the 80s it's going back.
Think so? Alright, what about the 50s? Think about what you know about 1950s culture.
Leave it fever.
That's what I'm thinking of.
And then think about what you know about these guys, alright? If these transcendentalists, they're kind of like the original hippies in one sense,
Yeah.
they are,
Yeah.
with their connection to nature, right?
They wouldn't fit into the 1950s.
They wouldn't fit. So then you're saying it became more traditional in the 50s? 1950s America, what do you think of? What comes to mind?
The rebels.
You think the rebels in the 50s? Like James Dean?
James Dean, yeah.
But he's only a rebel because he's in the
All
minority.
that Cold War.
He's only able to be a rebel because the majority was what?
Majority, yeah.
The majority was much more conservative and traditional, right?
Yeah.
Like, wouldn't Leave It to Beaver be more illustrative of the 1950s as a whole than James Dean?
Yeah, it's probably true. But he had a huge influence, though. So, I guess starting with it anyway.
It's interesting to think about American culture this way, and you can't really identify it until you start getting into the literature or into the arts, because literature is just one of the arts. You could look at the music, you could look at the movies, you could look at the paintings. Literature, I think, is the best, but because it explains things in such detail and it's less subjective sometimes than music or other art forms. But this does give us a lens into the way that American culture shifts. And people are concerned about this today. And they're worried about whether we are getting less traditional or more traditional. There are some people in America that don't want to go back to the ways of the past. Kind of like Emerson is saying, let's not go back to the ways of our forefathers because we can progress beyond that. But there are other people that say, we need to go back to the ways of the past, right? It's there are two types of people in America. Three. There are those that want to go back to the past, there are those that don't want to go back to the past, and then there are those that don't really give a crap about it, right? doesn't matter to them.
Most people want to pick and choose.
Okay, so I want to go back to the past for this aspect, but I want to move forward on this aspect, kind of like that.
Like past child discipline.
Yeah.
I don't like the direction we're heading with child discipline.
Because it's too lax or too severe.
Because they want to paint this world with Skittles and rainbows and unicorns, and it's not the case.
Yeah.
Even sports medals. When I was a kid, if you lost, you lost.
Right.
Nowadays, when my kids lose, they get a bloody trophy. Are you kidding me? That is the idealism that this world has started to teach these kids.
Right.
The world is not fair.
Right.
But they want to make it so wonderful that it's not going to be like that when they get out on our own. They're devastated. I think it's a poor step for our nation and the world.
Yeah.
Don't lay a hand on your kid. It's ridiculous to me. I turned out pretty damn well, if you ask me.
Right.
Believe me, I saw that belt many times when I was a kid.
Right.
But now, like in Germany, they've already passed a law. You touch your kids, go to jail.
Really?
Okay, so what do you do whenever they steal a car? You go to jail. Or your kid screwed up. What do you want to do?
That's interesting.
So that's a traditional. That's how they've always disciplined. Now that's
Right.
changing. So that's moving away from
Why do you think
tradition.
it's changing?
Because there's too many people out there saying that, well, you know, this is why kids are bad. This is why kids do bad things. I wouldn't entirely agree with that myself.
Right. Yeah, there are studies that say if you
Yell at your kid.
yeah, if you yell at them, if you hit them, that's going to cause mental problems down the road. So maybe people grasp onto these studies and they make too much of them, or they don't consider the other implications where, well, if you don't yell at your kids, they may end up being criminals, right?
Well, you have to discipline your children somehow.
Yeah. I mean, I taught high school for 3 years, so I hear what you're saying. I wish more parents would discipline their children in whatever way they need to do.
Establish boundaries somehow.
Right.
Like
So
that.
maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's more a lack of boundaries than a lack of post-boundary breaking discipline, right? Like,
My dad didn't believe in how to use his words, and that was the worst you could do to a child. Your words.
for you, that's the worst. But there are some kids you can yell at them all day, and it's not
He
going to
wasn't
make a
yelling. He
difference.
was talking, talking to you like you were a human being, and he was just like, it just really. It's worse than hitting me, because my
Yeah.
mom, she used to hit me, and I was like, okay with that. I'll get a bruise.
Right.
Maybe. Yeah, just a few bruises.
I think it definitely depends on the child or the person. But I can tie this into transcendentalism for you. I can make a really good tie into transcendentalism. Henry David Thoreau, did anybody read his background?
I didn't get a chance to get that.
He lost his job as a school teacher. Anybody know why? Robin knows.
Never.
See where the ruler came from? Ruler on the knuckles?
Sort of. You're like right on track. He was a school teacher, and I hate to bail on Emerson right now, but I will just for a second if I can find Thoreau 839. Only because it's relevant to what we're talking about. It's in his biographical information.
It's on 840 in that first paragraph.
Read it for me if you found it.
It says, after his 1837 graduation, he returned to Concord, where he briefly taught how to work at elementary school, before resigning in protest when he was instructed to flog some of his students.
There it is. So Thoreau said, I can't work here anymore because he was instructed to flog some of his students. Flog is whip, right? Yeah. And it may have been with a ruler or something like that. But he said, I can't do it. I'm not going to do that. Henry David Thoreau was, I guess we could call him a pacifist. He believed in and exercised nonviolent disobedience, civil disobedience. So he was totally, completely nonviolent. And actually, you can, if you'd like to, you can thank Henry David Thoreau for the actions or inactions of Gandhi and Martin Luther King Jr. because they drew heavily from his philosophy. Because it was effective to some degree, he practiced civil disobedience against the government when he didn't want to pay taxes. He said, I'm not paying them. I'm not supporting your expansive war against Mexico. I'm not going to pay that tax. And they said, okay, well, you go to jail. And he went to jail. So he knew the consequences of his actions. So if nothing else, he was a very principled person. And this idea of nonviolence ties in pretty well with transcendentalism. I don't know if we're going to see it with Emerson or not. I don't know if you'll see it with Margaret Fuller or not. But again, these people are very individualistic. So they have their own beliefs and their own concepts. But this idea of the nonviolence and the civil disobedience is usually very closely linked to transcendentalism. All right, back to Emerson. Back to Nature on 508.
Sounding more like the 60s right now.
It does in a way. It definitely does in a way, but I'm going to show you, if we can get to Thoreau, I'll show you a way that it's not. I'll show you a way that it's a lot different, too. He says on page 509, this is the chapter 1, Nature. Everything above chapter 1, Nature, that's some stuff that I really struggle to get through. So it's deeply philosophical. If you want to take a look at it and see if you can make some sense of it, go for it. But he talks about what nature is, what nature is not. So it gets pretty deep there. But chapter 1, he says, to go into solitude, when we talk about solitude, we're probably talking about the self here. To go into solitude, a man needs to retire as much from his chamber as from society. I am not solitary whilst I read and write, though nobody is with me. All right, I got to put the brakes on here as a reader. Like, wait a minute, dude, what are you talking about? Right, he says, I am not solitary whilst I read and write, though nobody is with me. Okay, then you're solitary by definition. Literally speaking, you just said you're solitary because nobody's with you. So I had to stop and think about this. What does he mean?
Voices.
What voice?
He hears voices.
He hears voices. All right, so option A, he's a little bit crazy, a little bit off his rocker. But there's an option B, too. If you are reading, let's say you're reading this all alone in your bedroom, are you truly alone?
You're being influenced
By?
by an author or somebody.
That's the voice he's hearing.
I feel that's fair enough for reading when he said write.
Okay, and
well,
so why are you not alone when you write? That's the next question.
so you can separate the thoughts in your head from the voice in the mouth.
It may not be so much hearing voices. If you write, who are you writing to?
And you're thinking of someone.
Someone,
Yeah.
or someone's, right?
Right.
Your audience. So your audience is with you when you write. He was writing for people to read. So he technically, in a different kind of way, he was not all by himself. His audience was with him. In his mind, not physically in the room, but he was thinking of who these people were, who were going to read his stuff, or who he wanted to read his stuff. So technically, he was not alone in his mind. Does that make sense? You got to put the brakes on these guys a lot and think about, okay, what are they talking about? But it makes some sense. When you read, you're not alone because you're with Emerson, or you're with Krevkor, or you're with Benjamin Franklin. Even though they're dead and gone, you're still with them. Those are their words. Those are their thoughts. And you can have a conversation. And that's actually what I try and encourage you to do when you read. Converse with these people. You can talk back. You can make notes in the margin, and those are your notes to Emerson. Now, is he going to hear them? No. But you might find those notes actually do get answered as you continue reading. Sometimes they'll answer the questions you have. Just by luck, it happens. But that's the goal. The goal is to actually interact with the text and interact with the ideas and the thoughts of these people. Because you do have the opportunity to. Emerson wasn't alone. Emerson was thinking of you when he wrote this stuff. Because you are his reader. So he had you in mind when he wrote this. Because I'm sure he had all of his readers in mind, whoever they may be. Alright, he goes on and says, but if a man would be alone, so if it could happen, let him look at the stars. The rays that come from those heavenly worlds will separate between him and vulgar things. One might think the atmosphere was made transparent with this design, to give man in the heavenly bodies the perpetual presence of the sublime. That's a big deal right there. He's talking about the sublime. This is a key idea for the transcendentalists. Alright? And here he's going to illustrate what the sublime means to him. Seen in the streets of cities, how great they are, referring to the stars, right? If the stars should appear one night in 1,000 years, how would men believe and adore and preserve for many generations the remembrance of the city of God which had been shown? But every night comes out these preachers of beauty and light the universe with their admonishing smile. Here's his illustration of the sublime. Imagine if you never got to see the stars but once in 1,000 years. Imagine what a big deal that would be. Like, people make a big deal about like Halley's Comet or something coming around, right? Because you don't get to see it very often. But since we see the stars almost every night, or every clear night, we don't really ascribe a whole lot of beauty to them, or maybe not as much as they deserve. Does that make sense? That's why I was trying to tell you on Tuesday, if you ever get the opportunity to go somewhere with zero light pollution, like the middle of the ocean, or somewhere way out in the country on a clear night, check out the stars, like spend a couple minutes, and you'll probably develop a different appreciation for their beauty. And I think that's what Emerson is getting at right here.
I sometimes spend all night.
You find a good place with no light pollution?
Yeah.
You ever been in the middle of the ocean?
Yeah, it's great.
Yeah.
It's great.
Alright. Turn to page 510. There's an illustration there on page 510. We'll get to the illustration in a second because he talks about that on page 511. But on 510, the first full paragraph, he says, "To speak truly, few adult persons can see nature. Most persons do not see the sun." Alright, so this is one of those times you have to put on the brakes. What does this mean? Everybody can see the sun. But I guess he's talking about the difference between seeing it and appreciating it. And that just reminded me of a good movie clip. Anybody ever see the movie White Men Can't Jump?
Yeah.
Wesley Snipes and Woody Harrelson.
Another smoker.
Alright, so he's saying most people can't see the sun. Those were his words, right? And we read that as like, what are you talking about? Like, of course we can see the sun. If I can find the right clip.
Or like hearing but not listening. Old school.
Dice que después de ver a un mago hacer desaparecer a su ayudante, Mr. Clean.
What if the movie's going to be in Spanish too? That could present a problem.
Un producto que hace desaparecer lo sucio. Lo llamó Magic Eraser. Limpia como por arte de magia. Hasta la grasa acumulada desaparece ante tus ojos. Magic Eraser de Mr. Clean.
Hey, you know what? Nobody has done that around here since the King and Duck Johnson. King and Duck. King and the Duck. Hey, who is this? Jimi Hendrix. No, I know who it is. Why are you playing Jimmy? Well, because I like to listen to it. Oh, you like to listen? That's what the fucking problem is. Y'all listen. Well, what am I supposed to do? Eat it? No. You're supposed to hear it. Hey, I just said I like to listen to it, man. No. There's a difference between hearing and listening. See, white people, y'all can't hear Jimmy. You're listening.
What the fuck are you talking about? His tone was white.
Get the fuck out of here. Jimi Hendrix's drummer was not white.
Yes, he did. Yo, check it out. See?
This is a picture. Oh, damn band is white except for Jimmy.
Alright, so anyway, the difference between hearing and listening, right? You think, well, it's the same thing. I think Emerson's making a similar point here when he says most adults can't see the sun. Like, you might look at it, I guess would be the analogy. You look at it, but you don't see it. Alright, so why? He goes on and says, at least they have a very superficial seeing. The sun illuminates only the eye of the man, but shines into the eye and the heart of the child. So the sun shines into the eye of the adult, but not into his heart, not into his soul. The lover of nature is he whose inward and outward senses are still truly adjusted to each other, who has retained the spirit of infancy. That's a pretty good phrase there, a spirit of infancy, even into the era of manhood. What is different about a child's spirit and an adult spirit when it comes to maybe observing things in nature?
Innocence of what
There's an innocence there.
the world around.
Uh-huh.
A wonder.
A wonder, like a curiosity or wonder. Like they're interested in stuff, right? Like my kids saw ants on the back porch yesterday, and they were all walking in a line. So I get the bug spray out, of course, but they're interested in what they're doing and like where they're from and like what they're up to. I'm just interested in killing these things so they don't get into the house, right? I've lost that spirit of infancy because I don't care what they're up to. I only care what they're up to so I can kill those things, right? So I can conquer them. But yeah, they have this spirit of wonder. They see things and they want to know about them. He goes on, he says, his intercourse, and I believe he's talking about the man who doesn't see. His intercourse with heaven and earth becomes part of his daily food. In the presence of nature, a wild delight runs through the man, in spite of real sorrows. Nature says, he is my creature, and maugre, and all his impertinent griefs, he shall be glad with me. Not the sun or the summer alone, but every hour and season yields its tribute of delight, for every hour and change corresponds to and authorizes a different state of the mind, from breathless noon to grimmest night. Nature is a setting that fits equally well a comic or morning place. In good health, the air is a cordial of incredible virtue. Crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight under a clouded sky, without having any in my thoughts an occurrence of special good fortune, I have enjoyed perfect exhilaration. I don't know if any of you ever connect to nature. Maybe you go hunting or fishing or walking, whatever it might be. But sometimes you might experience something like this perfect exhilaration. Almost I fear to think how glad I am. In the woods, too, a man casts off his years as the snake his slaw, and at what period soever of life is always a child. In the woods is perpetual youth. Within these plantations of God a decorum and sanctity reign. A perennial festival is dressed, and the guest does not see how he should tire of them in 1,000 years. In the woods we return to reason and faith. This is interesting. Return to reason and faith. Remember, the revolutionary period started to value reason over faith. Emerson is now saying you can find both in the woods, in nature. So we have a shift, right? Early Americans, pre-colonial to colonial, is all about faith and religion. Revolutionary period is a lot more focused on reason and science. Here we now have what looks to be some kind of reconciliation between the two, right? So we had faith and religion to start with the Puritans. Then we had a complete and total reaction against that, saying, no, let's look at what we can prove, not what we can't prove. Now we have reconciliation between the two, right? If you're looking for answers to life's deepest questions, which is what the transcendentalists do and what human beings tend to do, why am I here? Where did this world come from? He's saying you can find reason and faith in nature. Look for the answers in nature. That's where they're trying to find these answers to their questions. He says, there I can feel that nothing can befall me in life, no disgrace, no calamity, leaving me my eyes, which nature cannot repair. And here's a good quote, related to the quiz. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed in blithe air and uplifted it into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing, I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. That illustration on the left is the illustration of the transparent eyeball, or one person's illustration of it. So this is one of those deeply philosophical things. Maybe it's just a bunch of gibberish, or maybe you can make some sense out of this. But all you really need to know for the quiz anyway is who the idea of the transparent eyeball is related to. It'd be better if you understood what he's saying about the transparent eyeball and how it works, but I think it has something to do with this I am part or particle of God. So they see not a connection between God and nature. They don't see a separation between God and nature. Nature is God, God is nature. There is no creator and creation. It is all the same thing. Does that make sense? And he's saying he is part of it. Since he is part of nature, he is also part of God. Is that an arrogant thing to say from his perspective? Or does that make sense?
Sounds like you put a lot of thought into it.
Sounds like it. That's all these guys do is think, philosophize about things. What do you think, Paul? Does this make sense to you? Is this an arrogance? Is this a humility, maybe? think so, so he's somewhat humble about his place in the universe? Even though he's saying he's part of God?
I guess the way that he's so in awe of nature, he kind of humbles himself next to it, that he's humble to be part of it, I guess.
I could definitely see that from what he says. You know, if he has that spirit of infancy, because infants aren't typically arrogant, right? Little kids tend to be more humble, I think, than us very wise and smart adults, right? I could see that. All right, skip down to the next paragraph, but just make sure you do the best you can to understand the transparent eyeball, but at least recognize where it is in the text and where you can find it. Next paragraph, the greatest delight which the fields and the woods minister is a suggestion of an occult relation between man and the vegetable. And by vegetable, I think he's talking about any plant organism. All right, here we go. Tell me if he was smoking something or not. I'm not alone and unacknowledged. They nod to me and I to them. The waving of the boughs in the storm is new to me and old. It takes me by surprise and is not unknown. What's he saying? They nod to me and I to them. Who is they and them?
Plant life?
The plants. So is he crazy? Is he eating the wrong kind of mushrooms in the woods?
He's putting so much thought to it, or not that he thinks, but the wind, nodding, plants and whatnot, it's like they're nodding at me. Maybe he was smoking something at that time. It's just like they're nodding at me. Like someone would think a crack on the wall would be part of the universe or something. The Big Bang, related to that.
Right. There was a movie that came out not too long ago. I didn't see it, thank goodness, and I don't want to see it. But it was about this guy that fell in love with like the Siri device on his phone.
Oh,
Yeah.
You know what I'm talking about?
It's called Her.
He like developed a relationship with his phone.
I can bring it in.
Now we know that the phone is a, what's the word I'm looking for? Inanimate object, right? Even though it's somewhat animated by technology, it's an inanimate object, right? It's just a bunch of zeros and ones, ultimately. It's just a little piece of metal and glass and plastic, right? Ultimately, that's all it is. But he developed a relationship with it. Emerson didn't have a cell phone. Emerson didn't have a Siri, but he had the woods. And he's saying the greatest delight which you can get from nature is this occult relation between man and plants. What does occult mean? Strange, maybe? Supernatural, mystical, and magical. So this is something that he has experienced, obviously. Is it possible that maybe we can't quite connect? And I'm speaking in general terms, maybe some of you can, but is it possible that people in today's society don't connect with nature because we're not exposed to it as much, right? Like, how much of your day are you going to spend inside four walls like this as opposed to outside? You know, back then they didn't have air conditioning, they didn't have heat, you know, they didn't have nice little cars to transport them from one place to another. So their exposure to nature was completely different than our exposure. But our exposure to technology is completely different to theirs. So now we have people falling in love with their phones, right? Like, I bet you there are some teenagers, like, you try and take their phone away, they're going to have a serious emotional reaction because they love their phones on an emotional level, right? So I don't know. Is he crazy? Maybe. Have you ever heard the term, like, tree hugger? These guys were the original tree huggers. Like, he almost literally, like, hugs the trees. Like, so in one sense, they're very hippie-esque, right? In one sense. Toward the end of this paragraph here on 511, I'm sorry, the last paragraph before chapter 2. He says, yet it is certain that the power to produce this delight does not reside in nature, but in man or in a harmony of both. It is necessary to use these pleasures with great temperance, for nature is not always tricked in holiday attire. With the same scene which yesterday breathed perfume and glittered as for the frolic of the nymphs, is overspread with melancholy today. Nature always wears the color of the spirit. That's an interesting quote, and we're going to read a poem that really channels this same idea of nature wearing the colors of the spirit. Think about it. There are some days you go outside and it's like gray and gloomy and overcast. Like, there's some kind of emotional tie that we can assign to the weather, right? I don't know why, but it's almost like nature has its own spirit, right? If there's a tornado or an earthquake, like, that's scary. Like, we assign this emotion of fear or, disturbance to nature. So it's kind of interesting to assign like a personality and a relationship between people's emotions and the way people think to nature. And I think that's what he's up to here. And we'll get to a poem that does the same thing, I think, next week with their poetry. Alright, chapter 2. The only thing I think I want to talk about in chapter 2 is at the very bottom of page 511, 2 lines from the bottom. The misery of man. The misery of man appears like childish petulance when we explore the steady and prodigal provision that has been made for his support and delight on this green ball which floats him through the heavens. Green ball? What's he talking about? What is the green ball? The earth, right? So he's saying the misery of man. So to be upset on this planet, like if you are walking around upset, you are like a petulant child. What's petulance?
Discipline.
Kind of undisciplined, stubborn. So why, if you are miserable on this earth, are you like a petulant, undisciplined, stubborn, whiny child? According to Emerson.
You have everything you need to be happy.
Because you got everything you need. Everything you need has been provided for you, right? It says prodigal provision. Everything has been provided for you. He goes on to describe this, but I think that line there, or those 2 lines, I think that's an example of how he kind of weaves poetic language into his nonfiction, right? Because he says this green ball which floats him through the heavens. That's a pretty poetic way to say earth, right? It says, what angels invented these splendid ornaments, these rich conveniences, this ocean of air above, this ocean of water beneath, this firmament of earth between, this zodiac of lights, this tent of dropping clouds, this striped coat of climates, this fourfold year, beasts, fire, water, stones, and corn serve him. The field is at once his floor, his workyard, his playground, his garden, and his bed. He goes on and says, nature in its ministry to man is not only the material, but also the process and the result. So nature isn't just the tree, it's the growing of the tree. It's the death of the tree. It's the rebirth of the new seeds from the tree. That's nature, not just the seeds themselves and the tree itself, but the process. All the parts incessantly work into each other's hands for the profit of man. The wind sows the seed, the sun evaporates the sea, the wind blows the vapor to the field, the ice, the other side of the planet condenses rain on this, the rain feeds the plant feeds the animal, and thus the endless circulations of the divine charity nourish man. Now he says divine, right? He does not get completely away from God. I mean, divine means related to God, the divine blessing, the divine nature of nature. But that's a pretty good conception of how the world works, especially from a scientific point of view, right? So if you're interested in science and technology, and that becomes like your essay or your final presentation this semester, here's something you could draw from, scientifically speaking. That's pretty interesting and a pretty astute observation. I don't think many scientists today would argue with that cycle that he's describing. But it makes sense too, and that should give you some perspective on, you're upset because you broke your phone, or you're upset because you can't afford a new car. It's like, God's provided you with so much. Why be upset about the little things you don't have, right? You don't have to make the clouds in the sky to provide water to drink today. God took care of that for you. All right, he talks about beauty in chapter 3. He talks about the different types of beauty. You might want to be familiar with the different types of beauty that he describes, because there are more than one type of beauty. You probably don't have to read the language or the discipline section. Yeah, you could probably stop at beauty and be okay for the quiz anyway. Do read the American Scholar. That's after Nature. You want to read the American Scholar. Starts on page 536. You can check that one out. And I will give you the other concepts that we didn't get to today. Stuff that will be on the quiz. The concept of man as a machine / wooden man. Man as a machine / wooden man. We didn't get to that yet. Next, the contradiction between Christianity of, quote, this land. Contradiction of Christianity of, quote, this land versus true Christianity. The quote that says, imitation is suicide. Imitation is suicide. Look for that. Specifics on Frederick Douglass's education. Specifics on his education. We already talked about this on Tuesday, and it's not going to appear in any of the assigned writings, but the idea of material possessions. Do you remember who I said was the one that most rejected the idea of material possessions? You got 3 to choose from. It's not going to be in your assigned readings, so Benjamin, you remember who it was? The guy that threw the paperweight out the window because it was too much work? Robin, you remember who it was?
Thoreau.
It was Thoreau. Alright, so keep that in mind. There are readings in the textbook that describe this, and they do a good job of it, and if you want to read it, you can. It's from Walden, is the textbook assigned reading. So if you're interested in this idea of material possessions, it's Walden, and it's like the first couple chapters. He talks about economy, and like what people really need to survive. The idea of man thinking, quote, man thinking. One of the authors says there's a difference between a thinking man and man thinking. I already told you about the transparent eyeball. Covered the other 2 concepts. So I think we should be good. I think we touched on everything. Maybe we'll talk about Thoreau a little bit more next week since we didn't get to him today. But he's got some really good stuff. And if you read Thoreau, you might see how the transcendentalist movement and how Thoreau in particular would differ from today's tree huggers. Does that make sense? All right, see you all next week. Just a quick